AEESP has always been near and dear to my heart. I mean, it was part of my formulating my identity as an environmental engineer. I think I got a lot of encouragement, and then to watch particularly the growth and diversity in AEESP has been a delight. So I would just say whatever we need to do to keep that going, we should be doing. I went to Stanford between 1963 and 1967. And in those days, there weren't any women in the College of Engineering. I don't think I even thought about being an engineer. There are no engineers in my family. And it was exciting times in psychology at Stanford. They had a very strong group in social psychology. And it sort of matched the things that were going on in the 60s, which I was very involved with. So social change was something that I kind of grew up with. And it seemed compatible. There were exciting ideas going around in cognitive and social psychology, how people's attitudes changed, which very much fit in with social change. So after college, with a degree in psychology, there's not a huge number of professional opportunities. So I worked at different jobs. I finally got involved in about 1969 in some community organizing activities in San Francisco. So we ran what I would call an information exchange in San Francisco, but the information exchange was directing people towards social change activities. After that, a small group of us, we call ourselves a collective, which was appropriate with the times, started a consulting firm. We raised money from very well-to-do liberals to fund social change organizations. And in those days, it was anti-war, civil rights, farm worker organizing, all the kinds of interesting things that were going on in the late 60s, early 70s. Interestingly, so we were a collective. We put a cap of 5 years on the length of time people could spend there because we were very concerned about people becoming bureaucrats. And so we put aside money for ourselves so when we left, we would have a kitty. And I at that point, I started getting interested in going back to school. I'm not sure why I know why I picked civil engineering, because there was this public sector civic connection. So I used part of that kitty to go back to school. I lived in the Bay Area, so I went to Berkeley and I took calculus and physics. And then I went up to UC Davis. They were so welcoming. So I signed myself up for a second bachelor's degree in civil engineering. And I think, I don't know, motivation at the time was obscure. I certainly wasn't dreaming of myself as an engineer because of any experience I had. And I actually was able to get an internship at the Department of Water Resources in California, so that was good. And then I discovered that I loved what I was studying in engineering and civil engineering, so especially in the area of water. So I continued with that, got my bachelor's degree, went to work for the state of California at Water Resources, and then they encouraged me to go back to school to get my master's degree. So I went back to Davis and started on my master's degree, and then I discovered that I liked doing research. And it was a great time at Davis. Faculty were very excited about research in the program, so I had a lot of good colleagues, many of whom I still am in touch with. And after I got my master's degree, I just stayed. I got a fellowship and got my PhD, and then my advisors, Ed Schroeder and George Tabanagos, encouraged me to take a faculty position, which also I had no idea I wanted to do. So, and in those days, postdocs were much rarer. So I took a faculty position at Boulder. At the time, the environmental engineering program was very small. By the mid-'80s, it had shrunk to 2 of us. So I think a lot of my efforts during the '80s were focused on building up the environmental engineering program. And due to the efforts of all these great faculty who have come here, we are now 15 faculty. So it's a terrific program, and it's been a lot of fun to be part of the growth of that program. Over that time, I think some of the best things I've done is advised an amazing cadre of graduate students, a lot of whom hold university positions now, which is also exciting. And as I said, I've tried to play a role in improving the diversity of not just environmental engineering, but all of the engineering programs. In my department, I was chair for 8 years. We now have about 30% of the faculty are women. I'd love to see that on a college-wide or even a national basis. I think progress is being made. It's uneven, and sometimes there are pushbacks, and so we certainly have a lot to do in that area. I think the other piece, of course, is bringing in more people of color into engineering as well. So I used to be, I consider myself a feminist, but I used to fall more on the side of, well, you can't just add a lot of different people and things will change, and I've now changed my mind. I think if we have lots and lots of women and people of color and we represent the population, things will change per force. I've watched it happen, and so that's the area I've been working on the most lately as an associate dean for faculty development. So in CEA, in my department, we've started a systems group, and it has faculty from structures, water, resources, transportation, and then environmental engineering, particularly with the idea of bringing in elements of sustainability. So that could mean economic analysis, it can mean analysis of social factors. We start to figure out ways to incorporate concepts like well-being into how we design or analyze systems. And I think, there are quantitative tools that you can bring to bear, but also the incorporation of qualitative tools turns out to be important. So I'm a long way from my degree in psychology, so I need to talk to social scientists to find out what are contemporary tools, but I think it was helpful to me to at least have that kind of a lens to start viewing what I did as an engineer. And I think we're seeing it show up in our classes. We actually have classes that explicitly address sustainability. In the classes that I teach now, I teach a class in civil engineering systems, which incorporates tools, optimization or statistical modeling, but also economic analysis that bring in human factors, how agencies make decisions, how stakeholders participate in planning and design. So it's an exciting time because we get to actually work directly with people that I think as engineers we haven't been working with before. It's satisfying to me because it pulls out some of the interests that I've had for a long time. And I think it's exciting for the students. It's bringing in students who may not have considered coming into engineering before. So even in programs like Engineering for Developing Communities, global engineering kinds of programs, I think we're seeing more and more of that explicit incorporation of social and policy factors. It doesn't mean there hasn't been pushback. You may have to hunt around for journals or external funding that honor that kind of approach to doing research, but at the same time it makes it exciting, so it's kind of worth the challenge. I like working on international problems. I think one of the fun things about dealing with small community systems is that it automatically means you're looking at some things that I think research that we've done on on-site wastewater systems in the US, I find that those factors also come up in India and Bangladesh and Peru. So it's not, I think one of the interesting things is, yes, culture must play a very, very heavy role in how things are operated and accepted, but on the other hand, there are also some common kinds of threads that I think engineering or technology allows us to kind of bridge cultural divides or adapt our technology so we are culturally appropriate. So
So one of your latest papers was on small-scale systems, septic systems.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, we have actually two areas we looked at. One was directly, very hard to get data on on-site systems. Certainly they're not monitored, there's no reporting. So I had a wonderful PhD student, Laura Kohler, who was very, very diligent and resourceful at getting what I would call human factors data. She looked at permits, she looked at cost, she looked at factors like value of housing, she looked at location, she looked at whether or not there were regulatory requirements in place, and how did those factors influence whether a system was likely to fail or require extensive repairs. And then she extended that, and I think this was also very interesting, to looking at effects of weather climate on systems. And we had a major flood in Boulder in 2013, so she incorporated some very interesting results after that flood into looking at the resilience of that system compared to the very centralized system that we have for the city of Boulder, and the different responses of those systems in recovery from that flood, and then the differential costs. So when you can spread your repairs over 100,000 ratepayers as opposed to a single family residence who's also worried about rebuilding their home after the flood, or the fact that roads are in bad repair and they can't get materials in to repair things, that becomes another aspect of thinking about socially what kinds of systems do we want to plan in the face of who's going to be responsible for and accountable for and have access to resources to keep them going. So that brings in another social factor. We talked a lot about these systems aren't any good if they're not universal and universally supported. So again, here comes policy as a kind of backdrop for making those kinds of decisions. You know, watching the organization grow, I think at the time I started on the board, there may have been 400 or so members. And I think over that time that I was on the board, it grew by at least 50%, may have been 600 or more. I think the other thing that happened is we started thinking more about getting students, graduate students and postdocs involved in the organization. I think there was discussion even at that time, even though we're the Association of Environmental Engineering Professors, about getting people from the sciences involved since there's so much overlap. It will be interesting. I don't know, is there a discussion about people from the social sciences or the behavioral and economic sciences about possibly getting involved? I know that a lot of the research that our members do bridges into that area. So that might be an interesting area that the organization could be expanding to. Because I think there are more, I think that has an impact on those disciplines as well, that suddenly we have psychologists who are interested in how people make choices about things like water reuse, or economists, applied economists who talk about market-based kinds of systems. So if there's an avenue for them to do productive research and work with engineers, then I think those disciplines themselves can open up to different kinds of people, as opposed to, you know, people with a much narrower framework of the social sciences. So I've seen that a little bit here. I mean, we have an economist that we've worked with. At times he does a lot of work on valuation of the environment, and he used to laugh and call himself the only applied economist in the Department of Economics. And so now I think there are two, which is a doubling, but I think if those opportunities open up, that professional organizations welcome them to give papers, then I think we have an impact on the social sciences and as well as the economic sciences. So yeah, I think to see those lines blur is wonderful. I think that it's great when you're, you know, to have an identity, but then to watch that identity expand is also, I think, really fun. So so it'll be interesting to see then how that plays out in AEESP. Could it become AEESSSP, or I don't know, but, and again, you can see the same with the American Public Health Association, or, those fields, applied economists who do work in things like valuation or market-based approaches. And then with our students, encouraging them also to start to take courses where they're really learning the methodologies of those fields so they can apply them in a better way. I mean, I think sometimes we're too casual about doing things like how do you do surveys or observational kinds of things, and never mind how you incorporate that information into other kinds of analyses that you're doing. So that's been fun for me, teaching a systems class where I try to expose students to those methods and then have them applied in a case study way. But you're just skimming the surface. I think my hope, of course, is they understand how much there is behind each of those kinds of methods, and then get inspired to go take additional classes. So, or incorporate them into their research, which I also think is great.
Great.
When I came here, it was the same. People were going from that transition from the 70s, which was the beginnings of the construction grant program and EPA training grants. And I think a lot of the work of AEP then, and even through the time when I was on the board, was, it was really two things: establishing programs and curriculum in environmental engineering. So the field had an identity. And I think that really happened a lot even before my time on the board. That was the 70s and into the 80s. And then convincing the feds, including the EPA, that they should be funding, if you're going to have universal wastewater treatment in the United States, then you better have people, engineers, trained to do that. Same with drinking water treatment. So it was a time of trying to identify the profession, but also communicate the importance of that to students in terms of recruiting, but then also to federal agencies, which were going to form the backdrop, and to universities to get them to hire faculty in those areas. So I think even at Colorado, when I joined the department, environmental engineering, we were still thought of as sanitary engineers probably by 3/4 of the faculty. So that growth, that change really occurred in the 90s, I think, when people said, well, this is probably a very valuable part of an engineering curriculum in civil engineering. So now we see collaborations between environmental engineering and architectural engineering, building systems. Of course, there's lots of interchange between people who deal with energy systems, kind of unimaginable collaborations. And I think a lot of the seeds for that were kind of sowed in the 90s. That was the big jump from just trying to identify ourselves to becoming expansionists. I'm in the AAEE now S, the American Academy of Environmental Engineering and Sciences, who also, they were a little later than AEESP, but they made the transformation of incorporating science into the academy. And I think, they work closely with AEESP. That was another thing that happened in the 90s when I was on the board. We didn't have a heavy relationship with the academy, and I think that's gotten a lot closer over the years, which is a good thing. And I think, because the academy has so many people in the professions, in consulting or regulations, so now that's a nice continuum, I think, of the practitioners with the academicians. So, and I'm on the membership, the Eminence Membership Nominating Committee, so that's kind of fun too, because we're recruiting. So that would be another piece of communication through AEESP, is people who are interested in joining the academy, which has a lot to do with things like accreditation, and then I think providing this kind of forum for practitioners talking with people from academia.